Following the defeat of the German Empire in World War I, extremism rose in popularity in the new Weimar Republic, allowing the National Socialist German Workers' Party to gain votes in parliament, although a new member quickly popularized the party in the hearts and minds of the German people. That new member being Adolf Hitler. After a failed revolution in Munich and the Great Depression hitting the German economy extremely hard, the Nazis became the largest party in the country. In 1932, Hitler became Chancellor and then proclaimed himself Führer. Hitler's policies greatly improved many aspects of life for the typical German. However, the most important one was the rearmament of the German army, or the Wehrmacht, which was first used to remilitarize the Rhineland in 1936. This broke the Treaty of Versailles. Then, in 1938, the Wehrmacht crossed the Austrian border and annexed the country, once again breaking the Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Saint-Germain. By now, the United Kingdom and France had tried to limit the growing power of Germany by using appeasement, a diplomatic tactic that allowed Germany to obtain territory quickly and without any consequence. Prime Minister Chamberlain had used this unsuccessfully. This led to the annexation of the Sudetenland and the establishment of the puppet states of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia and the First Slovak Republic. By 1939, Hitler began to prepare for war with Poland and the future Allied powers, and declared war on September 1st, starting the war in Europe.
Halo, czy nas słyszycie? To nasz ostatni komunikat. Dziś oddziały niemieckie wkroczyły do Warszawy. Braterskie pozdrowienie przesyłamy żołnierzom polskim walczącym na Helu i wszystkim walczącym gdziekolwiek się jeszcze znajdują. Jeszcze Polska nie zginęła. Niech żyje Polska!
Poland was quickly defeated and was divided between the Soviet Union and the German Reich. Then, after invading Denmark and Norway, the Low Countries were quickly invaded. It almost seemed like a repeat of the First World War, but the Wehrmacht went through the Ardennes and quickly encircled Commonwealth forces at Dunkirk. This is where the timeline diverges, with the Wehrmacht being unsparing and choosing to attack the trapped pocket of troops on the French coast, then invading the rest of France. Along with the invasion of the Western powers, the Soviets invaded the Baltics and seized land from Romania and Finland. After a quick invasion of Yugoslavia and bailing out the Italians in Albania, the Wehrmacht invaded Greece and used Fallschirmjäger to invade Crete, the last bastion of Allied resistance. The invasion of the Soviet Union would be the biggest ground invasion in history. The main objective was for Army Group North and Center to drive through the Baltics and White Russia to push the Soviet armies into the major cities of Leningrad, Minsk, and Smolensk, allowing the 6th, 1st, and 17th of the Southern Army Group to encircle them. The rest of the divisions of the Army Group South would fight towards Kiev. This is another difference from our own timeline, with Operation Barbarossa following more closely to the Marx plan than the revisions by Hitler, focusing on the north rather than the south. However, the conquest of the Soviet Union was more than just a security guarantee of the Third Reich, and was far more sinister. The Nazi Party's doctrine envisioned Drag nach Osten, German for drive to the east. Although the idea of Drag nach Osten was harkened back to the time of Imperial Germany, it was planned meticulously by the Nazis and saw the colonization, forced deportation, enslavement and genocide of the Slavic peoples, as in their eyes they were Untermensch, or inferior. The 100 divisions of the German, Romanian, and Finnish armies crossed the Soviet border on June 22nd, pushing into Lithuania and Belarus, encircling many Soviet divisions in Minsk. To the south, across the Pripyat wetlands, the Luftwaffe attacks infrastructure, and air bases, immobilizing the Soviet Air Force around Kiev and Odessa. Romanian forces would begin to advance to Bessarabia and Transnistria. By July 17th, the German army would have a front line stretching from the Daugava River in Latvia to the Pripyat River in Belarus. Then, the Northern Army advanced to Leningrad, capturing the city. Meanwhile, Army Group Center was fighting to capture Smolensk. By September, Operation Typhoon would be enacted, the final push to the capital of Bolshevism. By now, Joseph Stalin's paranoia and the rapid advancement of the Wehrmacht towards Moscow fueled his fears of disloyalty or collaboration, and a purge of the general staff had ensued. Consequently, the lack of experienced generals chauffeured through inexperienced and untrained soldiers to command, such as in the case of the 8th Army, where in 1941 they switched generals every few months. Those who survived the purge were either ineffective or unwilling to do any counterattacks, setting up instead 5 army groups reinforced with the Reserve Army, or Stavka, which was notably commanded by Joseph Stalin himself. By September 17th, the Soviets enacted a defensive line around Moscow to prepare for the German attack. This was commanded by General Zhukov, and in cases where his forces were to get overrun, Cherevchenko to his south was to encircle. The 16th Army and the 4th Panzer Army began to push to gain the city of Kalin. However, the anticipation for a weakened and fractured army was false, allowing for Konev's forces to be able to counterattack. Just south of this battle, the 9th Army and 3rd Panzer Army advanced toward Yazama and Rezev. This again was countered by the 1st and 2nd Shock Armies under Zhukov. This concentration of German troops aimed for Moscow left their flanks exposed in Gomel. The opportunity to encircle the 2nd and 3rd Panzer Army presented itself, and a counteroffensive was coordinated, with the 30th Army entering Gomel on the 20th. On the 21st, the Southern armies also attempted to push back to Kiev. Fighting ensued at the city of Dnipro and Zaporizhia to capture the Rezev bridgeheads, which failed, resulting in a failed river crossing, allowing the Germans to encircle the Crimea and the majority of Kozlov forces in southern Ukraine. By the 25th, the Germans had reached Rostov, and Timoshenko had to divert a huge concentration of forces to prevent an incursion into the Caucasus. By October, Crimea and Rostov had been lost to the Germans and were approaching Kharkov and Kursk, and fell on November 10th and December 3rd. Soviet offensive plans to push back out from Moscow failed, although the Germans did not prepare for winter, adding time to the Soviet Union's existence. Although Operation Typhoon had not succeeded in its objective to take the Soviet capital, it gave way to Hitler's plan for taking out the Soviet Union through the destruction of its industry and seizure of its natural resources. This is also a crossroad for both the Stavka and the OKH for internal issues within their high commands. The OKH, spearheaded by the planner of Operation Barbarossa, Franz Halder, had been at constant odds with Hitler, and after the failure to capture Moscow during Barbarossa, Halder and the OKH lost more influence over strategy and planning to Adolf Hitler, which eventually leads to Germany losing the war, with his orders often being irrational and even feasible on a logistical level. However, with the somewhat successful capturing Kiev and Leningrad, planning for the German summer offensive would be in the hands of the OKH. Halder creates the plan for Case Blue, which was originally meant to take the Don River, including Stalingrad, then going to the Caucasus. The Volga River, on which the city of Stalingrad was built on, is extremely important to the Soviets, as it helped ship oil from Baku to the rest of the Soviet Union. Hitler originally wanted to take Maikop and Grozny for Stalingrad, which left their flanks open to Soviet troops heading south. However, taking Astrakhan along the Volga Delta would cripple the Soviet oil industry and prevent shipping in general. Logistically, distance was the largest problem for the operation, and in our timeline, the front lines were overstretching significantly, and supply problems would arise. This was predicted by Eduard Wagner of the OKH, but was ignored by Hitler. To emphasize this, they had to supply over 72 divisions worth of troops over a 2,540-mile distance, which would be requiring 700 tons per day and heavy fighting for a panzer division. An infantry division required 1,100 tons per day. Difficulties in fast-paced blitzkrieg tactics meant that to keep a panzer division supplied, which they often were miles ahead of the infantry, forced the supply columns to deliver the goods at a longer distance. Already you can see why Case Blue in the Battle of Stalingrad failed miserably. Strategically, another issue with Case Blue is its objectives. An army group would usually only have one objective, but Case Blue had three. Army Group South would be divided in two. Even though they were extremely short on manpower, the two army groups were more like half or even less. To quote Tick History, at a time when they needed two or maybe three army groups, the Germans had two half army groups, and they weren't even entirely German troops either. All this being said, if they went with the original plan, the Nazis could have won the Great Patriotic War. In theory. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, the loss of Leningrad would be top priority to the Soviets. The city, sitting on the Neva River below the Karelian Isthmus, was of huge importance to the Soviet people, both symbolically and literally. It was the former seat of the Tsar, and was the beginning of the revolution. Within the city, there were over 300 military production plants, producing artillery, rifles, ammunition, and tanks. In the 1930s, Leningrad had produced the majority of the T-26 light tanks for the Soviets and all T-28 medium tanks, and at the outbreak of the war, was producing the new KV-1. However, the city was captured too quickly to dismantle and mine the factories, leaving them partially unscathed as Axis troops occupied the city, giving more value to the city for both the Axis and Soviets. But this was a lie, or at least partially. Everything above the Neva River was still within the hands of the Soviets, being led by Zhukov within the Leningrad front, and Alexander Cherpon's 23rd Army, along with the resistance cells in the occupied southern districts. Being run by Andrei Zadunov von Lieb of the German North Army, had advanced farther than our timeline and was eager to conquer the city of Leningrad. The Marx plan had shown its success, and he could have made a city a necropolis upon a swift attack. So why not? Hitler, in his often ironic fumbles of leading a nation at war, planned on starving out the city and its inhabitants. To quote the journal of Franz Halder, it is the Führer's firm decision to level Moscow and Leningrad and make them uninhabitable as to relieve us of the necessity of feeding the population during the war. Truly an act of genocide. The refusal to enter the city for fear of an epidemic and further resistance had added time to the brave Leningraders and their allies across the Lagadoa.